Alright, here's a query for you. When you contemplate giants in the Bible, who comes to mind? Nephilim, correct? But did you know that the Nephilim are merely the tip of the giant iceberg? Indeed, the Bible is replete with numerous towering, larger-than-life figures that don't receive as much attention, and some are even more captivating. Today, we're delving into these lesser-known giants, those with distinctive quirks, peculiar tales, and yes, even some unusual physical attributes. Have you ever heard of the giant with 6 fingers and 6 toes? It sounds like a character straight out of a fantasy novel. For those of you already nodding, thinking, oh yes, I'm familiar with the Nephilim, this video is for you. We're not revisiting the old narrative of the sons of God and daughters of men. Instead, we're exploring the Bible's other giant clans, the Rephaim, the Anakim, and more, who were present long before David's duel with Goliath. These aren't just characters from some ancient story, many had interactions with ancient Israel and left a significant impact, even shaping parts of biblical history and prophecy. Today, we'll uncover the mysteries behind these giants, examining what they meant to the people of ancient times and why they might still have something to say to us today. Starting with the mysterious 6-fingered giant, our story takes us to 2 Samuel 21 verse 20, where we find a vivid description. There was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. This is a fascinating moment. Here, we have a brief but vivid description of a giant who is not only massive in size but also has a unique look with those extra digits. Imagine the reaction people must have had. He's not your average giant, this guy is part of the Rephaim lineage, a family of giants known to be a menace and a source of dread among the Israelites. So why would the Bible give us details about his fingers and toes? It sounds like such a small thing, right? But this isn't just a fun fact. In ancient times, people often saw physical traits as symbols, signs of either blessing or curse, and extra fingers or toes weren't just quirks, they might have been viewed as signs of otherworldliness, something that marked someone as different or even dangerous. This giant from Gath would have struck fear, not just because of his size, but because he had these extra digits that made him feel even more intimidating, like he was someone not to be messed with. Now, Gath, where this giant shows up, is a place you might recognize. It's also where Goliath, the giant who faced off against David, was from. This wasn't a peaceful town full of gentle giants. Gath had a reputation as a stronghold for some of the fiercest warriors around. It was Philistine territory, and these giants were known for their skill in battle. They were fierce, intimidating, and, to put it simply, the last folks you'd want to meet on the battlefield. When we read these passages, it's clear that this 6-fingered giant isn't just there for show. His presence represents a real threat to Israel, and he's part of a larger conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines. The Bible tells us that he was defeated by Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shemaiah. Imagine being Jonathan in that moment, facing off against this massive, intimidating figure with his unusual features, knowing that this giant came from a line of warriors who had been Israel's enemies for generations. It's almost like Jonathan is stepping up to prove a point, facing down this giant as if to say, you might be bigger, you might be different, but you don't scare me. In many ways, this encounter between Jonathan and the 6-fingered giant is about more than just physical strength, it's about courage, faith, and a willingness to face down something that others might find terrifying. When we look at these stories in the Bible, it's easy to see them just as battles between people, but they often carry deeper messages. This moment shows us the value of standing up against what seems impossible. Jonathan didn't let the giant's appearance or reputation stop him from fighting for what was right, and that's a lesson that the Israelites and we as listeners could take to heart. Another interesting part of this story is how these giants, like the one from Gath, are tied to the land and the culture of the Philistines. This isn't just any random fight, it's part of the larger, ongoing conflict between two very different cultures, Israel and Philistia. The Philistines were often at odds with Israel, both militarily and spiritually, and these giants represented one of the greatest physical threats to Israel's survival. When an Israelite saw a giant, it wasn't just about size, it was a symbol of the struggles they faced in maintaining their faith and identity. These giants were physical manifestations of Israel's obstacles, not just in war but in staying true to their beliefs amidst powerful enemies. What's also intriguing is that this giant isn't given a name in the Bible. When someone doesn't get a name, it can often mean they're there to represent something larger than themselves. The giant with 6 fingers and 6 toes isn't just a single individual, he represents a line, a family of giants descended from the Rephaim, and a culture that stood in direct opposition to Israel's beliefs. The Rephaim were known as a group of fearsome beings, sometimes considered remnants of an ancient, almost mythic race. So when Jonathan defeats this giant, he's not just overcoming a single person, he's striking a blow against a history, a legacy, and a looming presence that had haunted Israel for generations. And let's talk about why the Bible might mention these extra fingers and toes. Some scholars suggest that these extra digits could symbolize completeness, like a symbol of power or fullness beyond the normal. But in this case, it's almost as if his extra fullness of fingers and toes makes him an exaggerated version of the enemy. He's got more than he needs, extra fingers, extra size, and probably extra confidence, but it doesn't save him. In a way, his extra features make him a target, something that stands out, and Jonathan's victory over him is a reminder that no matter how imposing or unique the challenge, with faith and courage, it can be overcome. So this giant from Gath may not get as much attention as Goliath or the Nephilim, but his story is rich with symbolism. He's a reminder of the challenges Israel faced, both physically and spiritually, in their journey. And while his 6 fingers and 6 toes might seem like minor details, they help paint a picture of someone who was larger than life, not just in size but in the fear he inspired. But Jonathan's victory over him shows us that faith and determination can conquer even the most intimidating obstacles. The Rephaim giants are first mentioned as a kind of people or group who were already established in the lands that would eventually become Israel. These giants were spread across areas like Bashan and were even rumored to have populated the land of Ammon, Moab, and Canaan. When we hear Rephaim, it's not just a one-off mention, they seem to be a group that people just knew about, almost like saying the Vikings or the Mongols. Everyone knew they were tough and they had this almost legendary status that spanned generations. Interestingly, the word Rephaim sometimes gets translated to mean shades or spirits of the dead in some contexts. This gives us a little insight into how ancient people saw them. Were they literal giants, were they supernatural, or maybe a bit of both? Now, one of the biggest figures in the Rephaim lore is none other than Og, king of Bashan. We'll get into more detail about Og later, but for now, just know that he was a famous Rephaim king. The Bible even describes his bed, saying it was 13 feet long, which was basically a billboard declaring, "Yes, I'm a giant." So for the Israelites, the Rephaim represented more than just big warriors, they symbolized powerful obstacles. This group was known for their sheer strength and size, and they weren't easily defeated. We're talking about tribes that likely dominated parts of the ancient Near East who held lands that the Israelites eventually wanted to claim as their own. So naturally, this set the stage for some serious clashes. The book of Deuteronomy gives us a picture of how imposing the Rephaim must have seemed when the Israelites were preparing to enter the Promised Land. Moses reminded them of the Rephaim they'd have to face. He describes how other nations, even mighty kingdoms like the Ammonites and Moabites, avoided or even feared these people. For example, in Deuteronomy 2, Moses says the Rephaim were once called Emim by the Moabites. The word Emim literally means the terrors or the dreaded ones. Imagine that. These giants were so terrifying that their neighbors had specific words for the fear they inspired. But the story of the Rephaim isn't just about battles and territory, it's about a deeper struggle of faith and identity. The Israelites were on a journey to claim a land promised by God, but the presence of these giants was a constant test of their trust in Him. Think about it, you've been wandering the desert, and now you're told that you'll have to face a bunch of giants who've been ruling this land for ages. Talk about intimidating. Yet time and time again, the Israelites are reminded that no matter how big or scary the Rephaim are, God's promise is stronger. The giants, in this case, became symbols of fear that had to be overcome with faith. Now let's get into the specifics of where these Rephaim giants show up. We have accounts in books like Genesis, Deuteronomy, and even Joshua that describe encounters with them. Genesis 14 recounts a battle where the Rephaim were part of a coalition of kings engaged in warfare against other powerful entities, indicating that they were not some mythic group lurking in the shadows but were actively involved in the politics and conflicts of their time. They had kingdoms, territories, and likely alliances that made them a formidable force to be reckoned with. In the book of Joshua, another pivotal moment occurs when the Rephaim make their mark after the Israelites enter Canaan. Joshua leads them in battle against various groups to claim the land, and who do they encounter? Yes, the Rephaim. These were not minor skirmishes, the battles with the Rephaim were among the most intense the Israelites had to confront. They had to defeat the giants occupying the land as part of fulfilling their promise from God. It's almost as if the Rephaim were the ultimate final bosses before the Israelites could settle down. Interestingly, there's a passage in Isaiah 14 that some interpret as a poetic description of the Rephaim. It's talking about the spirits of the dead or shades in the underworld, and some scholars think it might be referencing these ancient giants as almost mythical figures in Israel's collective memory. Even if the Rephaim weren't alive in Isaiah's day, their reputation and influence lived on, showing just how much of an impression these giants made. They became part of the language people used to describe anything powerful, scary, or beyond human. Some scholars argue that the Rephaim giants might have roots in ancient folklore or even historical records outside the Bible. There's evidence in Ugaritic texts, for example, that refer to powerful warriors or beings similar to the Rephaim. These other cultures may have had their own legends about giant warriors, which eventually made their way into Israelite culture. So it's possible that the Rephaim represent a blend of historical figures and legendary qualities. Whatever the case, they were seen as more than just humans, they were formidable, larger-than-life figures. So what does all this mean for us today? Well, the story of the Rephaim giants is about overcoming immense obstacles. In a sense, everyone has their own Rephaim challenges that seem too big, problems that feel too intimidating. But just like the Israelites, there's always a way to face these giants, especially when we have something bigger than ourselves guiding us. Whether or not you believe in the literal existence of giants, the Rephaim's legacy serves as a reminder that fear can be conquered, that even the most imposing obstacles can be brought down. The Anakim giants. Let's start with what the Bible tells us about them. The Anakim are first mentioned in the book of Numbers when the Israelites send out spies to scout out the land of Canaan. These spies come back with reports that might sound like something out of a horror movie. In Numbers 13:33, they say, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Imagine how massive and imposing the Anakim must have looked for the spies to feel like insects in comparison. These giants were not just tall people, they were physically and mentally overwhelming, so much so that they made the Israelites question whether they should even enter the land. Now, let's break down who the Anakim were according to what we know from biblical and historical context. The Anakim were believed to be descendants of a figure named Anak, which is where they got their name. They lived in the hill country of Canaan, which included cities like Hebron. And if Hebron sounds familiar, it's because it later became an important city for the Israelites. But back in the days of Moses and Joshua, Hebron and other areas were occupied by these Anakim giants, who made the Israelites' goal of settling the land much more difficult. What's especially interesting is that the Anakim are sometimes associated with other giant groups like the Nephilim and the Rephaim. But while the Nephilim were more of a mysterious race with limited mentions, the Anakim were right there in plain sight, blocking the Israelites' path to their new home. This made them not just a physical obstacle but a major psychological one too. They represented everything that stood between the Israelites and their promised land. For the Israelites, facing the Anakim was like staring down their biggest fears, and those fears were literal giants. When it comes to encounters with the Anakim, one of the big moments happens in the book of Joshua. After the Israelites wander the desert for 40 years, they finally enter Canaan and start taking over the land. And guess who's waiting for them in some of the first cities they approach? That's right, the Anakim. Joshua 11 verses 21 to 22 tells us that Joshua went through the hill country, attacking the Anakim and driving them out of places like Hebron and Debir. But here's a twist, not all the Anakim were destroyed. Some of them managed to escape to the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Yes, Gath, the same place where Goliath, another famous giant, would later come from. So even though Joshua fought and won, the Anakim weren't completely wiped out, they just moved. This conflict with the Anakim is important because it highlights a bigger theme in the Bible. The Israelites were constantly having to face their fears and rely on their faith, especially when the odds seemed impossible. Think about it, you're standing there looking up at a giant who has probably lived in that land for generations. He's strong, confident, and probably not too thrilled about newcomers. But Joshua and the Israelites were determined to fulfill their mission, and their success over the Anakim was seen as a sign that God was with them, helping them do what seemed impossible. The Anakim, in many ways, symbolized the kind of challenges that seemed too big to overcome. They were physically huge, sure, but they were also powerful figures who could make even a whole nation pause. When the spies originally came back with their report, the Israelites almost decided not to enter Canaan at all because of how scary the Anakim sounded. But in the end, with faith and determination, they pushed forward, showing that sometimes the scariest challenges aren't really unbeatable. The presence of the Anakim also left a long-lasting impression on Israel's memory. Even after the Israelites took over Canaan, the stories of these giants were passed down. Here's something interesting. The Anakim left such a mark on the culture that people started using their name as a reference for anything unusually big or strong. The name Anakim became almost a synonym for giant or giant-like, and that tells you just how significant they were in the minds of the people. This reputation was so strong that even centuries later, when Goliath, who was from Gath, is described, people immediately think of the Anakim giants and their fearsome reputation. One reason the Anakim stood out is that they were not just warriors but deeply rooted in the land of Canaan. They were part of the very fabric of the land that the Israelites were supposed to take over. The Israelites didn't just have to beat them in battle, they had to face down generations of these giants who had dominated the region. It wasn't just about physical strength, it was a test of will and faith. The Anakim giants were part of what made Canaan such a daunting place to enter, and their defeat by Joshua was a huge turning point that showed the Israelites they could accomplish their goals with courage and faith. So why is the story of the Anakim important for us today? Well, it's more than just an ancient story about big people with big muscles. The Anakim show us that sometimes our challenges feel too big to handle, like we're up against giants. But as the Israelites learned, it's possible to overcome them with a strong heart and a little faith. The Anakim were intimidating, yes, but they were also conquerable, and that's something that resonates even today. Og of Bashan. First off, Og is mentioned in the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, where he's described as one of the last of the Rephaim giants. Remember, the Rephaim were a line of ancient giants who were widely feared, and Og was their king. Imagine being the leader of a group already known for their size and strength. This wasn't just a title, Og embodied the power and intimidation associated with the Rephaim. In Deuteronomy 3 verse 1, the Bible gives us a pretty amazing detail about Og. It says his bed was made of iron and was about 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. Now, just think about that for a second, a bed that big, it's like something out of a giant's castle. Clearly, Og wasn't just tall, he was a true giant in every sense, so much so that his bed size became legendary. Og ruled over the territory of Bashan, an area known for its rich land and fortified cities. Bashan was a strategic region east of the Jordan River, which made it a valuable prize in ancient times. But it wasn't just the land that was tough, it was also Og and his people who defended it. Og was a seasoned warrior who commanded respect and fear. His very presence was a challenge to anyone trying to move through the land. To the Israelites, Og wasn't just another king, he was an enormous threat they'd have to face head-on if they wanted to settle in the Promised Land. When the Israelites approached Bashan, they'd already heard of Og's reputation. They knew he was a formidable enemy, and they knew about his giant size and his iron bed, which sounds funny, but think about how intimidating that must have been to people who were not giants. Yet, despite all this, Moses and the Israelites didn't back down. In Numbers 21, we see that Og actually gathered his forces and went out to battle against the Israelites. This wasn't just any battle, it was a clash of wills and faith. Og wasn't going to make it easy for them. He represented the kind of opposition that would test every ounce of courage they had. Now, what's incredible is that despite Og's size and the strength of his army, the Israelites defeated him. In Deuteronomy 3 verses 1-3, we're told that God reassured Moses, saying, "Do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands." This victory wasn't just about taking down a big guy, it was about the Israelites overcoming one of their greatest fears. By defeating Og, they showed themselves and everyone around them that they could face giants, literal giants, and still win. It was a huge confidence boost for the Israelites, marking a major step in their journey into the Promised Land. Og's defeat had a lasting impact, not just because of who he was but because of what he represented. He was like a final looming obstacle standing between the Israelites and their future. Taking him down wasn't just a military win, it was a spiritual and psychological victory. By overcoming Og, the Israelites proved they were ready for the challenges that lay ahead. They could now look back and say, if we can beat Og, we can beat anyone. Og's defeat became a symbol of God's support for the Israelites, demonstrating that no matter how formidable the opposition, they were not alone in their struggles. What's also intriguing is how Og became integrated into Israel's history and collective memory. His name and story are referenced even later in the Bible as a reminder of that victory. In Psalms and other books, Og's defeat is cited as a symbol of God's power and protection. For generations, people would remember Og as the giant king who once seemed invincible yet was vanquished by the faith and courage of a people who trusted in something greater than themselves. Some scholars believe that the story of Og and his massive iron bed might have even spread beyond Israel's borders, becoming known among other cultures in the ancient Near East. After all, a giant king with a bed the size of a room is the kind of thing people talk about. But beyond the stories and legends, Og represents something more profound. He's a reminder that no matter how formidable an enemy might appear, faith and courage can make all the difference. Og's story encourages people to face their own giants, whatever those might be. And consider this, the Bible doesn't waste words. The fact that it takes the time to describe Og's size, his bed, his kingdom, all of it, indicates that he was significant in more ways than one. The Israelites needed this victory to prove to themselves and others that they were capable of facing tough enemies. Og wasn't just a physical giant, he was a symbol of the hurdles we all face when we try to reach our goals. Overcoming him meant overcoming more than just a single battle, it meant overcoming fear itself. The Emim and Zamzumim. So, we've covered some of the big names among biblical giants, but here's where things get even more mysterious. Let me introduce you to two lesser-known but fascinating groups of giants mentioned in the Bible, the Emim and the Zamzumim. These aren't the giants most people think of when they picture massive warriors in ancient Israel, but their stories add a whole new layer to the Bible's world of giants. They might not get as much attention as the Anakim or the Rephaim, but trust me, they're just as interesting. Who exactly were the Emim and Zamzumim, and why are they included in the Bible? Let's delve into it. First, let's talk about the Emim. These giants are mentioned briefly in Deuteronomy 2 verses 10 to 11, where it says the Emim had lived there before, a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaim, though the Moabites called them Emim. So the Moabites, who were neighbors to the Israelites, had their own name for these giants, Emim, which translates to something like, the terrors, or, the frightful ones. Based on that name alone, you can guess what kind of reputation they had. The Emim were seen as a terrifying group of giants who once roamed the land, and their very name reflects the fear they inspired in people who encountered them. The Emim giants were said to have lived in the land of Moab before the Moabites settled there. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, so they had a close connection to the Israelites. Imagine being one of the Moabites trying to settle in that land only to discover it was already inhabited by giants. Just like the Israelites facing the Anakim, the Moabites had to deal with these massive figures who seemed impossible to defeat. The Bible doesn't give us a lot of detail on the battles, but the fact that the Moabites eventually took over the land means they either drove out the Emim or outlasted them. Either way, these giants were part of the land's history and left an impression that lasted long after they were gone. Next, we have the Zamzummim, who are mentioned in Deuteronomy 2 verses 20 to 21. This passage says that they too were considered a land of the Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzummim, a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakites. The Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. The Zamzummim were giants who lived in the land that would later become Ammonite territory. Like the Emim, they were considered part of the Rephaim lineage, and just like the Emim, they had their own local name that hinted at their terrifying presence. Now, the name Zamzummim is interesting because it sounds almost like a made-up word. Some scholars think it might come from a root word meaning to buzz or to murmur, almost like the sound of muttering or chanting. This has led some people to suggest that maybe the Zamzummim had some kind of reputation for strange noises, sounds, or rituals that made them seem even more otherworldly. Imagine running into a group of giants who not only tower over you but also have this eerie reputation for strange sounds. It would make sense why people would be creeped out by them. The fact that both the Emim and Zamzummim are associated with the Rephaim shows us that there was a widespread memory or understanding of giant clans across the ancient Near East. The Rephaim, Anakim, Emim, and Zamzummim might have been different groups, but they all shared a reputation for being enormous, fierce, and nearly unbeatable. To the Israelites and their neighbors, these giants represented old powers, ancient beings who had once ruled the lands long before regular humans took over. The Bible often mentions these giants when recounting the journeys of the Israelites and other groups, reminding us that even before the Israelites arrived, the land had its own unique, larger-than-life history. What's also interesting is how the Bible shows the Ammonites and Moabites, who were distant relatives of the Israelites, facing their own giants. Just like the Israelites would have to overcome the Anakim, the Moabites had to overcome the Emim, and the Ammonites had to take on the Zamzummim. It's almost as if these giant tribes were a universal challenge that every group in the region had to deal with. Overcoming giants became a shared experience across these different nations, a kind of unifying challenge that required bravery, faith, and determination. These stories of the Emim and Zamzumim also carry a symbolic meaning. The giants weren't just physical obstacles, they were reminders of the challenges and fears that all nations faced as they tried to settle and establish themselves in ancient times. Claiming new land wasn't just about planting a flag, it was about facing down the fears and struggles that came with it. For the Moabites, Ammonites, and Israelites alike, giants represented those fears, things that seemed impossible to overcome but had to be defeated for them to survive and thrive. And just like with the other giants we've talked about, the stories of the Emim and Zamzumim remind us that even the scariest obstacles can be overcome. The fact that these groups were eventually driven out or destroyed shows us that no matter how terrifying the challenge, there's always a way to face it. The Ammonites and Moabites didn't have the same relationship with God as the Israelites did, but they still managed to conquer these giants, showing that courage and determination are universal qualities that anyone can rely on. Giants in the Bible remind us of one simple truth: no matter how big the challenge, it's not insurmountable. These stories are ancient, but their lessons are timeless. They urge us to face what scares us most, to look at our biggest fears dead on, and to trust that we have what it takes to overcome. Whether it's a real-life giant or a massive personal hurdle, remember, faith, courage, and resilience can carry us through anything. If these stories gave you new insights, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into biblical mysteries, and share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. Let's keep exploring these powerful stories together. See you in the next one.